Before I tell you this, I want to say something plainly because I wish someone had said it to me plainly once a long time ago. Pay attention to the moment you feel seen, not flattered, not admired. Seen, it is a small thing and a dangerous thing. And it can undo 40 years of careful, quiet living, faster than you'd think possible. I didn't lose anything in the end, but I came close enough to understand how people do. So if you take nothing else from this, take that, watch for it, and when it comes, ask yourself honestly what it's telling you about the life you're already living. Now let me start at the beginning. My name doesn't matter much here. Call me whatever you like. A woman in her 60s, married 34 years to a good man named Walter. I say good, and I mean it without irony. Walter never raised his voice at me. He never forgot an anniversary, though. In later years, he'd have his secretary remind him, which amounts to the same thing, if you're generous about it. And I tried to be. He worked hard his whole life, first as a mechanical engineer, and then for the last decade before retirement as a plant manager, overseeing men half his age, who called him sir without being asked to. He was the kind of man other men trusted instinctively, the kind who fixed things around the house without being asked, who checked the oil in my car every month like a small, unspoken vow. We had 2 children, both grown now, both living in cities. I have to look up the time difference. For before I call, our daughter is out west doing something with data. I've never fully understood despite her patient explanations at Christmas. Our son is somewhere colder, married to a woman I like more than I sometimes let on, with 2 children of their own who call me on a screen and hold up drawings for me to admire through glass I can't reach through. We had a house with a yard that Walter mowed every Saturday in perfect diagonal stripes like he was still drafting blueprints, and a garage that smelled permanently of cut grass and motor oil, and a mailbox he repainted every spring, whether it needed it or not. We had, in other words, a life that from the outside looked like something to be grateful for, and I was grateful. I want to be clear about that, because what I'm about to tell you isn't a story about a bad marriage. It's a story about a quiet one. There's a difference, though. It took me a long time to understand it. By the time I was 59, Walter and I had settled into a rhythm that neither of us questioned. He woke first always at exactly 6, and by the time I came downstairs, the coffee was made and the newspaper was folded into thirds beside his plate, waiting. He read it in the same order every day. Front page, then business, then the obituaries, which he claimed was just practical at our age, though. I think it was something closer to superstition, a way of checking each morning that his own name wasn't in there. I did the crossword at the same table in silence, and it was a comfortable silence. I want to stress that, comfortable, but it was silence all the same. Sometimes an entire breakfast would pass with nothing exchanged, but the sugar bowl slid wordlessly from his side of the table to mine because he'd learned decades ago that I liked it in my coffee. And I'd stopped needing to ask. We'd stopped asking each other how we were, not out of cruelty, but because we thought we already knew the answer. Fine. We were fine. Everyone is fine until they aren't sure anymore what the word means. I'd catch myself some evenings watching him from across the living room. Him in his recliner with the television murmuring something about weather or politics, me with a book I wasn't really reading, and feel a kind of tenderness so worn in, it barely registered as feeling at all. Love, I think, doesn't disappear in a marriage like ours, it just gets quieter. It moves into the walls, the way heat moves into a house in summer, present everywhere and impossible to point to. I used to lie in bed some nights, Walter breathing evenly beside me, his hand sometimes finding mine in his sleep out of habit rather than intention, and ask myself a question I never said out loud. Are you happy? Not miserable, not wronged, just, was I happy in the way I'd imagined? I would be back when I was 25 and certain that marriage was a door you walked through into something larger, something that kept opening onto more rooms the longer you lived inside it. I didn't have an answer, I'm not sure. I even let myself look for one. You don't when you're the one who's supposed to be holding everything steady. Somebody has to be the level surface everyone else builds on, and for Years in our house that had been me. I remember one particular night, that spring, lying awake long after Walter had drifted off, listening to the house settle the way old houses do, a tick in the baseboard heat, the refrigerator cycling on downstairs. The particular silence of a street where everyone else is also asleep, and thinking with a kind of mild, distant alarm that I could not actually remember the last time anyone had asked me what I wanted. Not what needed doing, not what was for dinner, what I wanted, the way you'd ask a person who still had wanting left in her. I didn't know, lying there, that an answer to that unspoken question was already on its way toward me, wearing a stranger's face, carrying an umbrella he hadn't yet had reason to bring to my door. Walter's company had a new plant manager brought in from the regional office, younger, mid-40s, a man named Daniel, who'd been hired, as far as I understood it, to modernize things. Walter had built the old-fashioned way. There was some tension in that at first, that Walter didn't talk about directly, but that I could feel underneath his silences at dinner. A proud man being asked to defer to someone 20 years his junior, learning new software systems at an age when he'd expected reasonably to be the one training others instead. I felt for him during those months, more than I let on. I didn't yet know that the very man unsettling his professional footing would before long unsettle something in me, too. I met Daniel first at a company dinner, one of those long, dull affairs with a rubber chicken buffet and a slideshow about quarterly numbers, projected slightly crooked on a screen. Someone had forgotten to square up. I remember exactly what I was wearing, a blue dress I'd had for years. Comfortable rather than flattering, the kind of dress you choose when you've stopped dressing for anyone's eyes but your own comfort. Walter introduced us proudly, one hand on my shoulder, in that way. He had presenting me like a project he was pleased with. "This is Daniel, he's turning the whole operation upside down, in a good way," he said. And Daniel shook my hand, a firm, unhurried handshake, the kind that doesn't rush to let go, and said, "So you're the one who's been putting up with him for 30 years. I have questions." It was a joke, a small, ordinary joke, the kind spouses hear 100 variations of at 100 company dinners over the years, usually forgotten before the appetizer plates are cleared. But he looked at me when he said it, really looked the way you look at someone you're curious about, not someone you're being polite to at your boss's insistence. And I laughed harder than the joke deserved, and something in me sat up and paid attention for the first time in longer than I could say. It wasn't attraction, not yet, not in any way I would have named as such. It was simpler than that, and stranger than that. It was the sensation, entirely unfamiliar after so many years of being looked at as though I might have an interesting answer. I didn't think anything of it, I want to be honest with you. I drove home that night with Walter, half asleep in the passenger seat, tie loosened, talking sleepily about the new inventory system Daniel wanted implemented by fall, and I thought about the drive and the weather, and whether we had milk, and whether I'd left the porch light on. I did not think about Daniel, not that night, not for weeks afterward. He was a name Walter mentioned over dinner sometimes. Daniel wants this, Daniel thinks that, filed away in the ordinary background noise of a marriage, no different from any other name that drifted through our kitchen from Walter's working life. It was months later that Walter had to travel for a 2-week training program in another city. Something to do with the new systems Daniel was implementing, ironically enough, sent by the very man who'd unsettled him to learn to work more like him. And the house went quiet, in a different way than I was used to. The silence of two people who know each other so well, they don't need words, empty quiet. I hadn't realized how much of the day's shape came from another person simply being in the house, even in silence, even 3 rooms away, with the television on, until he wasn't there to be that shape at all. On the 3rd day, it rained hard, the kind of rain that turns the driveway into a small brown river, and drums against the gutters until the sound becomes its own kind of silence, and my car wouldn't start. I sat in the driver's seat, turning the key again and again, that useless clicking sound, feeling more foolish and more alone than the situation Really warranted. I called the office where Walter worked because I still had the number memorized from years of calling to say dinner would be late, and somehow I still don't entirely know how some misdirected transfer some receptionist assuming I wanted the manager on duty. I ended up with Daniel on the phone instead of the mechanic I'd meant to reach. "I can come get you," he said before I'd even finished explaining the problem. "I'm 10 minutes from your street, I think." Walter showed me a map once, bragging about his lawn. I could hear the smile in his voice, easy, unbothered, as though driving across town in the rain for his employee's wife was the most natural favor in the world. I said no, "Of course, the way you're supposed to," he said. He was already getting his coat, and 20 minutes later, he was standing on my porch in the rain, hair plastered down his shirt, darkened at the shoulders, holding an umbrella he hadn't used on himself, and he said, "You look like you haven't been out of this house in days." And I laughed because it was true, and because no one had noticed that about me in longer than I could remember. That should have been the end of it. A ride to the mechanic, a thank you, a closed door. And for a while it almost was, I remember thinking as I watched his taillights disappear down the wet street after he'd dropped me back home with a working car and a receipt I didn't need, that the whole episode would fold itself neatly into an anecdote, the kind you tell at dinner parties years later. Asterisk, remember when your boss drove out in the pouring rain to rescue me? With no weight to it at all, but small things accumulate. That's the part no one warns you about. It isn't one dramatic moment that undoes a person. It's 100 small, forgettable ones that turn out only in retrospect to have been building toward something. A returned umbrella, a conversation that runs 10 minutes longer than it needs to, a question asked at exactly the right, wrong moment. He returned my umbrella himself instead of sending it with someone else, which struck me only afterward as a choice rather than an accident, and stayed on the porch for 20 minutes talking about nothing. His kids, who lived mostly with their mother 2 states away, and his divorce 3 years old, and still tender when he mentioned it. The way you'd touch a bruise to see if it still hurt. There was no self-pity in how he talked about it, only a kind of plain honesty I wasn't used to hearing from men his age or any age. I made coffee because it seemed rude not to, and we sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I do the crossword in silence every morning. And for the first time in years, I had a conversation that didn't feel like maintenance. It felt like discovery, the slow, pleasurable work of learning a person's shape, their opinions, the things that made them laugh unguardedly. "Are you happy?" he asked me out of nowhere, stirring sugar into a cup he hadn't touched yet, his eyes on the spoon, rather than on me, as though he understood. The question needed somewhere neutral to land. I remember laughing, uncomfortable, the sound coming out sharper than I intended. "What kind of question is that?" "An honest one. Nobody asks it anymore. Everybody asks how you're doing, and everybody says fine, and nobody means anything by it." He looked up. "Then I'm asking the real one." I didn't answer him, not that day, but the question followed me around the house for the rest of the afternoon like a smell you can't quite place, surfacing while I folded laundry, while I watered the plants on the windowsill, while I stood at the sink washing the 2 coffee cups and setting them carefully in the rack to dry. I always did, except this time it didn't slide off me. This time it stayed insistent, refusing to be filed away. With the dishes, there were other meetings after that. I won't pretend there weren't, and I won't pretend I didn't on some level arrange for a few of them, though. I told myself each time it was coincidence or convenience, or simple neighborliness. A coffee near the pharmacy, where I happened to be picking up Walter's prescription, and Daniel happened to be getting his oil checked at the shop next door, both of us lingering longer than either errand required. A walk along the river path one Sunday, when Walter was golfing, where Daniel fell into step beside me like it was the most natural thing in the world, and asked me about my life before. Walter, who I'd been, what I'd wanted back before I became somebody's wife and somebody's mother in line waiting, back when I still had a whole unwritten future instead of a well-worn one. Nobody had asked me that in decades. I'd nearly forgotten there was an answer. I found myself telling him things I hadn't said out loud in years, that I'd once wanted to study botany, that I'd given it up without much protest when Walter's career started requiring us to move, that some part of me had never quite forgiven the version of myself who'd let it go so easily. He didn't try to fix it or console me out of it. He just listened, nodding slowly, letting the silence after my sentences stretch instead of rushing to fill it, and something about being heard that completely made me feel for the length of that walk. Like the sky over the river had gotten a little wider. I want to tell you honestly what those meetings were, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes this story worth telling. They were not romantic in any way you'd recognize from a film. He never touched me beyond the ordinary. A hand at my elbow crossing a wet patch of sidewalk, once briefly brushing my hair back from my face when the wind caught it and I hadn't noticed. An unthinking gesture he seemed almost surprised to have made. He never said anything crude or forward. If anything, what made it dangerous was precisely how careful he was, how he seemed to understand better than I did myself that what was happening between us needed room to be what it was, without being pushed into something uglier, something that would have cheapened it and made it easy to name and easy to condemn. I won't pretend I didn't feel guilty. The guilt arrived early and stayed the whole time. A low hum underneath everything, like a radio left on in another room, never loud enough to make out the words, but never quite absent either. I loved Walter. I want that understood clearly. I was not looking to leave him, not looking for anything really, except, and this is the part that shamed me most, I was looking to feel again like a person worth noticing. Not a wife, not a mother, a person, the one who'd existed before all those other roles folded over her like layers of sediment, pressing her down into something solid and useful, and largely unremarked upon. There's a particular kind of guilt that comes from doing nothing wrong and feeling wrong anyway. I'd rehearse conversations with Walter in my head, not confessions, exactly more like arguments I was building in my own defense in case I ever needed them. Asterisk, we only talked. We only had coffee. Nothing happened. Asterisk. And it was true, nothing happened in the sense you're probably imagining, but something was happening all the same in the quieter rooms of me, and I knew it, and not telling Walter about it felt like its own kind of betrayal. Even while I told myself I hadn't betrayed anything at all, I'd catch myself mid-conversation with Daniel thinking, Walter doesn't know I'm here. And the thought would arrive with a small electric jolt that was half shame and half something I was reluctant to call alive. I started noticing things about my marriage. I'd stopped noticing the way Walter and I passed each other in the kitchen like two people who'd memorized a choreography, rather than two people actually seeing each other, sidestepping without looking up, reaching around one another for the coffee pot or the car keys with the unconscious ease of long practice. The way our conversations had shrunk over the years to logistics. What time, who's picking up, did you call the plumber, is the trash out? I didn't blame him for it. I'd done the same, shrinking myself, had let my half of every conversation narrow down to the same practical bones. But sitting across from Daniel, watching him actually look at me while I spoke, watching his attention stay on my face rather than drifting to his phone or the television or the next item on some invisible list, I felt the absence of that in my own home more sharply than I had in years, and I hated how much it hurt to notice. I remember standing at my bathroom mirror one morning during that stretch, studying my own face with an attention I hadn't given it in ages. The lines at the corners of my eyes, the gray I'd stopped bothering to color, the tiredness that had settled in around my mouth without my quite realizing when it arrived, and feeling a confusing mixture of grief and something almost like hope. Grief for the years that had slipped past while I wasn't looking closely enough at myself to notice them going. Hope, strange as it sounds, that it wasn't too late to want something again. One afternoon, the 12th day of Walter's trip, I remember because I was counting the way you count down to something you're afraid of and drawn to in equal measure. Daniel and I sat on a bench near the river, the water low and slow in the late summer heat, a few late boats drifting past without much urgency. We didn't speak for a long time. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that only happens between people who've stopped performing for each other, who no longer feel the need to fill every gap with noise. "You know I can't be the answer to whatever this is," he said finally, not looking at me, looking out at the water, instead his forearms resting on his knees. "Whatever's missing. I'm not it. I couldn't be, even if things were different." I know that I said, and I did know it, though hearing him say it out loud landed somewhere tender, a small clean ache, like pressing on a bruise you'd forgotten was there. "But I think you already knew that before I said it. I think that's not really what any of this was about." I didn't answer right away. The river kept moving the way rivers do, indifferent to what's happening on their banks, carrying a stray leaf past us and out of sight. He thought about it a long moment, turning his wedding ring, his old one still worn out of habit or reluctance, I never asked which, absently, around his finger. "I think you needed someone to ask if you were happy, and actually wait for the answer." I didn't have the answer that day either, but something about hearing it framed that way, not as a betrayal I was constructing, not as a romance I was inching toward, but as a question I'd simply stopped letting anyone ask me, cracked. Something open that I couldn't close back up the way it had been. I sat with that sentence the rest of the walk home, turning it over the way you'd turn over a stone you'd found somewhere unexpected, trying to understand what exactly it was and why it had been sitting there waiting for me to notice it. I went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table where Daniel and Di had had coffee weeks before, the light going gold and then gray through the window over the sink, and I looked at the chair where Walter usually sat with his newspaper folded into thirds. Empty now, waiting for a man 3 days from returning, and I let myself cry for a while, not out of grief. Exactly, more out of relief at finally admitting there was something to grieve, not my marriage, but a version of myself. I'd let go quiet without noticing the botanist, who never was the woman who used to have opinions about things other than dinner and doctor's appointments. Walter came home 3 days later. Tired from travel, his suitcase still smelling faintly of hotel soap, full of stories about the new systems Daniel had installed at the plant, oblivious, genuinely entirely oblivious to anything having shifted at all in the house he was walking back into. He hugged me in the doorway, the way he always did, a solid familiar hug, his chin resting briefly against the top of my head, the way it had for 34 years, and for a moment I let myself simply stand inside it without deciding anything, without weighing it against anything else, just being held by the person who had held me longest. That night, after he'd unpacked and showered and settled into his side of the bed with a paperback he'd bought at the airport and barely started, did something I hadn't done in years. I put my hand on his arm, his forearm still faintly tanned from summers of yard work, familiar under my palm in a way that surprised me with its comfort, and said, "Walter, are you happy?" He looked at me like I'd asked him something in a foreign language, setting the book face down on his chest, one eyebrow raised in the way it did when he was deciding whether I was joking. "What kind of question is that?" "An honest one," I said, my voice steadier. "Then I felt I want an honest answer, and I'll give you one too if you ask me back." He set the book down entirely then, on the nightstand, which felt significant in a way that a small gesture shouldn't. It took him a while to answer, longer than I expected, long enough that the ceiling fan completed several slow rotations above us, long enough that I understood the silence itself was an answer of a kind, the same silence I'd been living inside for years without naming it. "Finally," he said, quietly turning to look at me directly, for what felt like the first time in months. "I don't know anymore." "I used to think I did." "Neither do I said. "But I'd like to find out with you, if you're willing." He reached over and took my hand, not the practiced absent gesture of habit, but something more deliberate, and held it for a long moment without speaking. "I'd like that too," he said finally. "I don't know why we stopped asking each other things. I won't tell you that conversation fixed Everything, because that isn't how these things work, and I don't want to lie to you the way I once quietly lied to myself. What I'll tell you is that it was the beginning of a different kind of conversation between us, one we hadn't had in a very long time, about what we actually wanted from the years we had left, rather than simply what we'd assumed we should want because we'd wanted it once, decades before, back when wanting things came easily and hadn't yet had to survive 30 years. Of practicality, I saw Daniel a handful more times after that, always briefly, always at company functions, where Walter was present too, and something had settled between us into something plainer and gentler than what it had almost been. Not quite friendship, not quite the thing it could have become, but something honest, at least something I didn't have to hide or rehearse explanations for. We'd nod across a crowded room, exchange a few sentences by the drinks table about nothing consequential, and there was no ache in it anymore, or at least not the same kind of ache. At the last one, a retirement dinner for a colleague of Walter's, held in the same banquet hall where I'd first met Daniel over rubber chicken and a crooked slideshow, he found me near the drinks table and said simply, "You look happier." "I'm working on it," I told him, and I meant it as the truth. It was no longer needing to dress the sentence up or explain it away. "Good," he said, glancing briefly across the room to where Walter stood laughing with a group of engineers, easy and unguarded in a way I hadn't seen from him in a long while. That's all it was ever supposed to do. I think about that sometimes, that the whole strange, aching, guilty, illuminating stretch of those weeks wasn't really about him at all. In the end, he was a mirror I happened to look into at exactly the moment I needed to see something in myself I'd stopped looking for. I don't know if that makes what I did forgivable, or unremarkable, or simply human. I've stopped needing it to be any particular thing. It happened. I didn't cross the line I was afraid of crossing, though. I came close enough to understand finally why people do, how ordinary the reasons usually are, how rarely it has anything to do with the person crossing over, and how much it has to do with the quiet, cumulative ache of not being asked anything real. For a very long time, Walter and I are still married. We talk more now, actual talk, not just logistics. Some nights over dinner, the newspaper left unread beside his plate, for once, some nights not until much later, lying in the dark, the way young couples do, as if we have all the time in the world to figure each other out again, which I suppose, at our age, we don't, and that urgency has been its own strange gift. We started taking walks together in the evenings, the same river path where I once walked beside someone else, and it has become slowly ours again, rather than a place I once borrowed. For a different purpose, I think about the question often, "Are you happy?" And I no longer treat it as something to dodge or something to answer with the reflexive, meaningless fine weed worn smooth between us. For years I ask it of myself, the way you'd check a pulse regularly without panic, just to be sure the thing you're relying on is still beating the way it should. Some days the answer surprises me. Most days now, it's yes. So if you're somewhere in your own quiet marriage, your own comfortable silence, and someone looks at you one day, the way no one has looked at you in years, I'm not going to tell you to run from it, because I don't think that's honest, and I don't think fear ever taught anyone anything useful, but I will tell you this: don't mistake the feeling of being seen for the person doing the seeing. Ask yourself what it's telling you about the life you already have, and then go home and ask the person you built that life with the same question you were so relieved to finally hear. Are you happy? Wait for the answer, really wait. That's the part most of us forget how to do. That's the whole confession, really not an affair, just a woman who forgot for a while that she was allowed to ask.